It was subtle, surgical, almost polite. You let them believe the version of you that made them comfortable. The harmless one. The agreeable one. The one who nodded, smiled, absorbed disrespect without protest. They mistook restraint for lack of depth, kindness for lack of intelligence, patience for lack of strategy. That's always the mistake. People who survive by manipulation rely on quick reads and lazy assumptions. They see what they want to see because it keeps the hierarchy intact. You played that role perfectly, not because you were weak, but because you understood something they never did. The most dangerous person in the room is the one no one is watching, and while they congratulated themselves for having you figured out, you were quietly learning the room, the players, the angles, the pressure points. What made the act so convincing was that it wasn't entirely fake. You really were calm. You really were observant. You really didn't need to bark to feel powerful. But they filled in the blanks with their own arrogance. They assumed innocence meant ignorance. They assumed softness meant surrender. That assumption became the foundation of their disrespect. They spoke down. They tested boundaries. They grew careless. And you let it happen, not because it didn't register, but because you were collecting information. Psychology calls this asymmetrical awareness. One side believes it understands the other. The other side understands everything. That imbalance is lethal, and it only exists when ego blinds one party to the possibility that they are being studied. The disrespect escalated, because it always does when people think there are no consequences. They pushed further, said more, revealed more. Power reveals character when it thinks it's unobserved, and you gave them that illusion of safety. You didn't challenge the narrative. You didn't rush to correct their assumptions. Silence became your camouflage. In their minds, you were static, predictable, beneath notice. Meanwhile, the dynamic was already shifting. They were exposing motives, alliances, insecurities. They didn't realize every careless comment was a confession. Every slight was a map. Every attempt to undermine you showed exactly where their own weaknesses lived. They believed the act protected them. In reality, it disarmed them. There's a reason your silence unsettled them only after it was too late. Silence before power is revealed feels harmless. Silence after power is revealed feels terrifying. When you finally showed your hand, it wasn't by shouting or threatening. It was through clarity, through decisiveness, through a move so precise it reframed every interaction that came before it. Suddenly the past made sense. The patience, the restraint, the way nothing seemed to stick to you. Their laughter stopped because the joke turned inward. The person they underestimated wasn't slow. The person they dismissed wasn't naive. The person they tested wasn't defenseless. That realization doesn't just surprise people, it destabilizes them. What broke them wasn't the reveal itself, but what it implied. If you were capable of this all along, then every assumption they made was wrong. Every position they took over you was unearned. Power politics thrive on perceived superiority. The moment that perception collapses, so does authority. They began replaying interactions, searching for signs they missed, moments where the mask slipped. That mental rewind is brutal. It forces them to confront their own arrogance, and arrogance hates mirrors. Your reveal became a mirror they couldn't look away from, reflecting not just your strength, but their miscalculation. From that point on, the balance shifted fast. Conversations changed tone, eyes lingered longer, confidence evaporated. You didn't need to assert dominance. The room did it for you. Once people see someone reclaim agency after being underestimated, the psychological hierarchy rearranges itself automatically. Respect flows toward competence, not noise. Your rise didn't require approval because it was self-authored. That autonomy is what rattled them. They were used to controlling outcomes by controlling perception. But perception slipped out of their hands the moment your true capacity became visible. And unlike them, you didn't need to manage impressions. You let reality speak. The unraveling came quietly, just like your act. They overcompensated. They tried to regain footing. Some became defensive. Others became overly friendly. Both reactions revealed fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing relevance, fear of being outplayed by someone they never took seriously. This is the cost of underestimating someone who understands timing. You didn't reveal your hand early because early reveals invite resistance. You waited until resistance was useless. By the time they understood the game, the board had already changed. That's not cruelty. That's intelligence applied without emotion. Your rise wasn't fueled by revenge. That's what confused them most. They expected bitterness. They expected payback. Instead, they got composure. Growth without resentment is unsettling to people who rely on emotional chaos to feel powerful. You didn't need to embarrass them publicly. Their internal collapse did the work. Once the illusion shattered, every future interaction carried the weight of what they now knew. They couldn't unsee it. They couldn't go back to treating you casually. And that permanent shift is what makes your reveal irreversible. Power, once recognized, doesn't need to be announced again. There's a deeper lesson embedded in all of this. Innocence is not the absence of strength. Sometimes it's the discipline to not deploy it prematurely. You understood that dominance revealed too early becomes a target. Dominance revealed at the right moment becomes fate. They confused your restraint with submission because they project their own impulses onto others. They act when they feel powerful. You acted when it mattered. That difference separates impulsive authority from real control. One burns fast, the other endures. Your presence alone rewrote the rules because power doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, changes the temperature of the room, and lets everyone else feel the shift before they understand it. That's what happened here. You didn't need to explain yourself. You didn't need to correct the past. The moment you stood fully in who you are now, the old dynamic stopped working. The jokes fell flat. The disrespect lost its edge. The assumptions expired on the spot. People sensed it instinctively, the way animals sense a change in hierarchy without anyone saying a word. Your posture, your restraint, your lack of urgency signaled something final. The rules they relied on only applied when you were smaller. The second you stopped fitting into their expectations, the game changed, and they were still playing by outdated instructions. What really unsettled them was how effortless the shift appeared. They expected dominance to look aggressive, loud, emotional. Instead, they encountered composure. Calm is disarming when people are used to chaos. It forces them to self-regulate, and most can't. Your presence demanded accountability without asking for it. Suddenly, people measured their words. They hesitated. They thought twice. Not because you threatened them, but because they could no longer predict you. Predictability is the backbone of control. When that disappears, so does leverage. The rules rewrote themselves because you no longer provided the cues that once kept everyone comfortable. You stopped playing the part that made their behavior make sense. There's a psychological law at work here. Groups unconsciously organize themselves around the most stable person in the room. Stability doesn't mean softness. It means emotional regulation, self-possession, internal clarity. When you entered spaces carrying that kind of stability, the group recalibrated. People who thrived on dominance felt exposed. People who relied on manipulation felt seen. And people who were neutral gravitated toward you without understanding why. You didn't take authority. Authority migrated. That's how rules change without debate. The center of gravity moves, and everything else adjusts or collapses. Another rule you shattered was the belief that power must be proven repeatedly. You didn't rehearse your worth. You didn't argue your position. You simply occupied it. That removed the need for constant performance. The moment you stopped explaining yourself, explanations lost value. The moment you stopped reacting, provocation lost purpose. This is where their confusion turned into fear. Fear doesn't come from aggression alone. It comes from realizing the old tools no longer work. They could no longer bait you, rush you, corner you. The playbook failed, and when a system fails, those who depend on it panic. Your presence also disrupted the economy of attention. Before, attention flowed toward the loudest voice, the most dramatic behavior, the most controlling personality. Now it flowed toward stillness, toward someone who didn't compete for the spotlight, but commanded it by default. That shift is devastating to people who equate visibility with power. You demonstrated something they couldn't replicate. You showed that influence doesn't need constant motion. Sometimes it just needs alignment. Once people feel alignment, they stop responding to noise. And those who survive on noise start sinking. Another rule rewritten was the idea that history defines authority. They leaned on past dynamics, past mistakes, past versions of you to justify their position. Your presence invalidated that leverage. Growth erases old contracts. You don't owe consistency to people who benefited from your confusion. The moment you showed up as someone new, the past lost its grip. That's terrifying for anyone who relied on memory to maintain control. They realized their advantage had an expiration date, and that date had already passed. The shift also exposed the difference between performative confidence and embodied power. Performative confidence needs witnesses. It needs applause. It needs reinforcement. Embodied power needs nothing. You didn't look around to see who was watching. You didn't adjust yourself for approval. That indifference wasn't arrogance. It was freedom. And freedom destabilizes systems built on dependency. When one person steps outside the emotional economy everyone else is trading in, the entire structure starts to wobble. The rules change because the currency changes. Your presence forced people to confront themselves. Not through confrontation, but through contrast. Standing next to someone grounded makes instability obvious. Standing next to someone disciplined makes impulsiveness look childish. Standing next to someone clear makes manipulation clumsy. You didn't accuse anyone. You didn't call anything out. You let contrast do the work. Contrast is ruthless. It exposes without attacking. And once exposed, people either evolve or retreat. Most retreat. That's not your responsibility. That's the cost of growth. Another invisible rule you rewrote was access. Before, people felt entitled to your time, your energy, your reactions. Now access required alignment. Not permission alignment. You didn't announce boundaries. You embodied them. And embodied boundaries don't invite negotiation. They simply exist. People felt it immediately. Conversations shortened. Entitlement faded. The dynamic adjusted because you no longer met people where they were comfortable. You met them where you were honest. That honesty has weight. It changes how people approach you, or whether they approach at all. Perhaps the most important shift was internal. The rules changed because you changed how you see yourself. Once that happened, external hierarchies lost relevance. You stopped asking where you stood. You stopped seeking signals. You stopped measuring yourself against the actions. That internal repositioning reflected outward. The world responds differently when someone no longer needs validation to act. Your presence carried that independence. And independence is the one thing no manipulative system can tolerate for long. What truly shattered their footing was realizing the rules didn't change because you demanded they change. They changed because the old ones no longer applied to you. That distinction matters. When someone argues for power, others resist. When someone embodies it, resistance becomes irrelevant. You didn't overthrow anything. You rendered it obsolete. The systems they relied on were built to manage insecurity, reward noise, and punish quiet strength. Once you stepped into yourself fully, those systems couldn't categorize you anymore. And when systems fail to categorize, they panic. People cling to labels because labels give them control. You walked in without one. That absence of definition unsettled them more than any confrontation ever could. Another quiet devastation came from how little effort it took on your part. They exhausted themselves trying to interpret you, trying to adjust, trying to regain advantage. Meanwhile, you conserved energy. That imbalance exposed the truth about power. Real power is efficient. It doesn't thrash. It doesn't scramble. It doesn't explain itself to people committed to misunderstanding. Watching you remain centered, while they spiraled, made them feel foolish. And foolishness is unbearable to pride. They weren't losing because you attacked. They were losing because they couldn't provoke you into losing control. Every calm response, every measured pause, every moment of non-reactivity deepened their confusion and accelerated their collapse. The rules also shifted in how people spoke about you when you weren't present. Before, your name was a punchline or an afterthought. Now it carried weight. Conversations lowered in volume. Speculation replaced certainty. Respect crept in where dismissal once lived. You didn't campaign for that shift. You didn't need to. Presence does the campaigning on its own. When someone embodies consistency, integrity, and restraint, others recalibrate unconsciously. The same mouths that once minimized now hesitate. The same minds that once dismissed now reconsider. That social reorientation is slow but irreversible. Once people feel a new gravity, they don't forget it.